Hey everyone, welcome back to System Shogun, where we make Azure easy. Today I will show you how to create a virtual network, or VNet, in Azure, set up two virtual machines inside it, install MySQL on one of them, and connect to it from the other, all without using public IP addresses. That's the key here. We're not going to be using public IP addresses. All of the resources will reside within the Azure environment, which is key when we want a secure environment. We don't want our resources to be accessible from the outside directly. Okay, let's jump in. First things first, let's talk about the VNet. A VNet, or virtual network, is basically a private network in Azure. It allows our resources, like virtual machines, to securely communicate with each other without exposing them to the internet. When we create our VNet, we're creating a closed network that only our machines can access, making it ideal for secure connections. Here is a diagram that I found online. And here, as you can see, we have a virtual network. And within that, we have some virtual machines, load balancers, and everything is private. So no one from the outside can connect directly to these resources, to these VMs. The only way that someone from the internet can communicate with our infrastructure is by using the application gateway. You're only allowed to use our infrastructure, our backend, through this application gateway. Okay, so now let's get to the Azure portal and start provisioning services. Let's first create a resource group. As you know, resource group is a logical container for our services. Let's create one now. So what this gives us is, like I said, a logical container for our services. So this way we can provision all of our services for a given application in one place. And let's say tomorrow we want to get rid of this application. Well, we can delete the resource group, and we know that all of the resources will be deleted as well. So no charging will be left over. Okay, let's name this our resource group. And let's create it. Let's go to the resource group. It's empty. Now, let's start by creating a virtual network. In Azure, pretty much everything is a resource. Let's create a virtual network now. Look for virtual network. And here it is. Let's create it. I'll name it my virtual network, my VNet. It will be residing in my resource group that I just created. Now, we'll enable Azure Bastion. So what is Azure Bastion? Well, to access the VMs that we're going to be creating later, well, we will be creating those VMs, but these VMs will not have public IPs. I'll create them without any ports, any inbound ports open. That's because I want as much security as possible, so no open ports at all at first. And since we're not having SSH, we won't be able to connect to the VMs. One way is Azure Bastion. With Azure Bastion, we can connect to VMs without using SSH. So Azure Bastion provides a secure way to connect to our virtual machines through the Azure portal without exposing them to the public internet. This way we're keeping everything secure and within Azure's private network. So that's why we need Azure Bastion, and we'll see it in action soon. Other than that, let's see what we have here. We are creating a default address space with 65,000 addresses. That would be enough for our purposes. Let's now create this virtual network. Okay, deployment is complete. As you can see, we started at 6:51 and it took like nearly 20 minutes. So keep that in mind. Anyways, let's go to the resource, which is our VNet. And here it is. We have an address space, which is the one that we created by default. It has 65,000 IP addresses. What do we have here? We have subnets, although we didn't create any. These are the default ones. Let's now go ahead and create a virtual machine. Let's go to the resource group right here. Let's go to create. Search for virtual machine. Here it is. Let's name it my VM1. We don't need any availability zones. Okay, we'll leave that as is. We'll use Ubuntu. We'll use this tier right here. We will not be using public keys. We'll use, let's name this Calata. Let's use this. Okay, and here we will not be using, if you remember about our talk about Bastion, we will not be using any ports. That includes SSH. So click none. Let's go to networking now. As you can see, Azure already knows that we've created a virtual network, so it will be using that one. So we don't need public address. We will not be using public address for this. We want our virtual machines to be private and not accessible over the internet. Let's say you want to create a database, and we will create a database. Well, you don't want that database accessible if you're creating an application. Well, then again, your database needs to stay private. It shouldn't get any public endpoints. It shouldn't have public IP. The only way that someone connects to the database is through any other layer, like your application, for example. So the application, let's say app service, could be public, and people will be logging in that application, interacting with it, and that application then can interact with the database, but you cannot interact with the database directly. Okay, enough management. Nothing here, nothing here. We don't care about these. Let's create the virtual machine, and I'll see you in a bit. Okay, the virtual machine is deployed. Let's go ahead and check it out. As you can see, it doesn't have public IP address accessible over the internet. It only has private IP address, which is the one right here. Let's now create our other virtual machine. So the idea is to have one virtual machine that has a database, and we will connect to that virtual machine from the other virtual machine. Let's now create the other virtual machine. The process is identical. We'll even use the same SKU for it. Let's name it VM2, no availability zones, same OS image, same SKU, networking. Let's remove the public IP and let's create it. Okay, great. Okay, so our second VM is also deployed. Let's check it out. Same thing, no public IP, only private IP address. Let's go to our resource group for a second. Let's open our virtual network. And let's take a look at connected devices. Here are our two interface cards for our two VMs. As you can see, VM1 has this private IP and VM2 has this private IP. Now let's connect to our VM1 using Bastion. Type our username and password and connect. And this is how easy it is to connect your virtual machines without using any ports, any SSH ports, without using any public IP addresses. And this makes your infrastructure way more secure than using public IP addresses, than enabling SSH ports. All that is a potential security risk. Okay, we're now in our VM and we want to install MySQL here. First, let's update our repo. Now let's install MySQL Server by using sudo apt install SQL Server. Say yes. This will take some time, so I'll see you guys in a bit. Okay, so our MySQL Server is now installed. We now need to bind our SQL Server to our private IP address. Now here, let's look for bind address right here. And let's change that to 10.0.0.4. If you remember, that's the IP of VM1. That's the private IP. So we now want to bind the address to this private IP address and not to use localhost. Good. Let's save this. Now we need to set up MySQL root. To do that, let's type sudo MySQL secure installation. And let's say here Remove anonymous users. Let's disallow root login. Let's don't delete this database. Yes. Okay. Now let's try and connect to our MySQL server using root. Okay, we're in. Now what I want to do is to create a user that we will be using to connect to this database, because as of now we cannot use root outside this virtual machine. Okay, to create a user, we'll type create user. Let's name it Kalata. It's bit by. Let's type password as the password. No, let's grant all privileges on to Kalata. And now flush privileges. Boom. Great. So we are good with VM1. We have a MySQL server. We created a user and we'll use that user to connect to this database from VM2. Let's now connect to VM2 and see if this works. Let's go to the resource group, find VM2. Here it is. Let's connect. Type username and log in. Now we need to install the MySQL client so we are able to connect to our server. To do that, again, update the repo. Now let's install MySQL client. Okay, this is now done. Let's now try to connect to our SQL server from here. To do that, type MySQL h, type the private IP that we binded it to, -u for username. The username is Kalata, -p for password. Let's check if this works. Let's take a quick look at the big picture now. We have two VMs. We have a VNet. We are using Bastion to connect to our virtual machines. And everything is private. We don't have any public IPs. So no one can connect and interact with anything in here because it's private. And make sure that you don't use any public IP addresses, any public endpoints if you don't really need to. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. I hope you learned something today. If you liked the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others. Until next time, keep being this awesome. System Shogun out.